Do you remember those kitchen tricks that turned scraps into suppers and stretchers into feasts? In the 1960s, African American home cooks were masters of making a little go a long way, blending thrift, flavor, and tradition into everyday meals. These clever techniques weren't just about saving money, they carried culture, resilience, and family through every pot and pan. Today, we're bringing back 30 of those smart, soulful tricks that still have plenty to teach us. Reseasoning yesterday's beans. There's a certain magic that happens when a pot of beans sits overnight. In African American kitchens of the 1960s, beans weren't just a meal, they were an investment. A pot of pinto beans or red beans simmered low and slow on Sunday could feed a family for days. But by day 2, nobody was thrilled to see them again. That's when reseasoning came to the rescue. With a few clever tricks, yesterday's beans transformed into something new, hearty, and worth crowding around the table for. The idea was simple. Beans had already done their job of soaking up smoky ham hocks or salted pork the first time around. By the second or third day, the flavor needed a little wake-up call. Cooks reached for chopped onions, a splash of vinegar, maybe a fresh chili pepper or spoonful of bacon grease saved in a coffee can. Suddenly, what could have been leftovers became a brand new dish with sharper edges, brighter flavor, and renewed life. Some households even mashed the beans slightly, turning them into a spread for cornbread or a thickened stew over rice. Nothing went to waste, and each reinvention felt intentional rather than repetitive. The emotional resonance here is powerful. Beans weren't glamorous, but they symbolized comfort, stability, and the kind of resilience that made a dollar stretch when it needed to. Children might have rolled their eyes at beans again, but by the second night, they were scooping them eagerly over rice with hot sauce drizzled on top. Today, this practice feels almost prophetic. Food bloggers rave about meal prep hacks and next-day flavor. But those ideas are rooted in traditions like this one. Reseasoning wasn't just practical. It was proof that creativity in the kitchen could turn scarcity into abundance. Cornbread croutons. If you've ever had day-old cornbread, you know it doesn't exactly sing the way it did fresh out of the oven. By the second day, it's dry, crumbly, and usually destined for the trash. Or at least, that's what modern kitchens might do. But in African American households of the 1960s, wasting food wasn't an option. Out of this frugal mindset came one of the cleverest little reinventions: cornbread croutons. What sounds like a gourmet twist you'd find in a hip cafe today actually began as a humble kitchen trick, born of necessity. The process couldn't have been simpler. Leftover wedges of cornbread were cut into rough cubes, tossed with a dab of bacon grease or butter, and toasted in the oven until golden and crisp. These crunchy bites instantly elevated a pot of greens, added texture to simple soups, or topped a salad long before salad culture made its way into everyday meals. The beauty lay in their adaptability, seasoned with black pepper for savory dishes or dusted with sugar and cinnamon for a sweet snack. Every stale piece of cornbread found a second life. More than a trick, cornbread croutons carried with them the spirit of resourcefulness. Families could stretch meals without spending a penny more, turning what looked like scraps into something exciting. Kids who grumbled at another bowl of collards suddenly perked up when those crisp golden cubes floated on top. It was a small act of transformation, proof that cooking wasn't only about feeding the body but about sparking joy, even in the middle of an ordinary weekday dinner. Today, chefs might brand this as Southern rustic flair on a restaurant menu. But in the 1960s, it was simply survival with a dash of creativity. Cornbread croutons are a reminder that thrift, flavor, and delight can live side by side. Greens twice over. In the kitchens of the 1960s, collard greens weren't just a side dish, they were a ritual. A pot of greens simmered long and slow with smoked ham hocks, onions, and a sprinkle of red pepper flakes brought families together around the dinner table. But what happened after the greens were eaten was just as important as the dish itself. The flavorful broth left behind, affectionately called pot liquor, was far too precious to waste. And so came the tradition of eating greens twice over. Day one meant a steaming plate of tender collards or mustard greens, served alongside cornbread to soak up the juices. But by day two, that pot liquor, rich with vitamins, smoky pork essence, and layers of seasoning, was transformed into something new. Cooks might add beans, rice, or diced vegetables to stretch it into a hearty soup. Some households dropped dumplings right into the broth, while others ladled it over grits for a comforting breakfast. Even without the greens themselves, the liquid carried enough flavor to stand on its own, proof that nothing in the pot went unloved. There was more than thrift at play here. Greens twice over spoke to a philosophy that every part of a meal had value and that care and preparation echoed across days. Families struggling to make ends meet could extend one humble bunch of greens into multiple meals without anyone feeling deprived. For many, that broth was also tied to memory. Grandmothers insisting it was good for you, mothers passing down unspoken lessons about nourishment and resilience. Today, chefs bottle bone broth and tout its health benefits. But this wisdom was already alive and well decades ago in African American kitchens. Greens twice over wasn't just a trick. It was culinary foresight, turning simplicity into sustenance and leftovers into legacy. Rice as the great extender. If there was one grain that knew how to earn its keep in the 1960s African American kitchens, it was rice. Cheap, filling, and endlessly versatile, rice became the quiet hero of many meals. Meat was expensive, vegetables could be seasonal, but a sack of rice? Well, that was security. Families leaned on it to stretch stews, bulk up casseroles, and even sneak into desserts. It wasn't just a side dish, it was a great extender, making a little food go a very long way. Picture a pot of red beans bubbling on the stove. On its own, it might feed a family for one night. But spooned over rice? Suddenly, that same pot stretched to 2 or 3 meals. Ground beef, too, found new life when rice was stirred into meatloaf or hamburger patties. Nobody complained. Rice absorbed the seasonings, carried the flavor, and made it all taste heartier. Even soups that seemed a bit thin were rescued by a scoop of rice, which thickened the broth and filled hungry bellies. But rice didn't stop being savory. Sweet rice pudding, flavored with nutmeg, cinnamon, and a splash of evaporated milk, turned the simplest pantry staples into comfort food. Leftover rice often made its way into breakfast bowls reheated with butter and sugar or drowned in milk. Every grain mattered, and none went to waste. Emotionally, rice was more than food, it was peace of mind. Parents knew that no matter how lean the week got, there was always something to fill the plates. And while today's food bloggers rave about budget-friendly staples or meal preps under $10, the truth is this: our grandparents mastered that art decades ago. Rice wasn't fancy, but in its quiet way, it made sure nobody left the table hungry. It was the unsung backbone of resilience, leftover fish cakes. In the frugal kitchens of the 1960s, throwing out food was unthinkable. Every scrap had potential, and fish, often bought fresh on Friday or caught from a nearby river, was no exception. After the first night's fried fish dinner, there were usually a few flaky pieces left on the plate. Rather than let them sit forgotten in the icebox, clever cooks transformed those bits into something entirely new: leftover fish cakes. What began as a way to save money quickly became a dish in its own right, loved for its crispy edges and savory flavor. The method was straightforward but ingenious. Leftover fish was flaked apart and mixed with binders like cornmeal, crushed crackers, or even day-old bread soaked in a splash of milk. Chopped onions, peppers, or a sprinkle of herbs added personality, while a spoonful of saved bacon grease or lard bound it all together. The patties were shaped by hand and fried in a cast iron skillet until golden and crisp on the outside, tender on the inside. Suddenly, what looked like scraps became a hearty new meal that paired beautifully with greens, grits, or even tucked into a sandwich. For many families, these cakes carried more than just flavor. They carried pride. Children might not have realized that supper came from yesterday's leftovers. All they saw was a plate of something delicious, hot, and comforting. The dish spoke of resourcefulness, but also of care. The determination to feed a family well, even when money was tight. Today, chefs would label this sustainable cooking, or call it a rustic fish patty. Foodies would line up to pay for it at brunch spots. But back then, it was just plain common sense. Leftover fish cakes remind us that thrift and creativity often walk hand in hand. Ham hock magic. In the heart of African American cooking during the 1960s, few ingredients held as much quiet power as the humble ham hock. It wasn't glamorous, more bone than meat, often overlooked by those who could afford better cuts. But in the right hands, a ham hock could transform a pot of plain beans or greens into something smoky, savory, and deeply satisfying. This was the true magic of the ham hock, taking what others dismissed and coaxing out flavors that tasted like abundance. Cooks would begin by simmering a ham hock low and slow, letting its marrow, skin, and slivers of meat infuse into the pot. Beans that might otherwise be bland became rich and velvety. Collard greens softened into tender ribbons, their bitterness mellowed by that porky depth. Even a pot of cabbage or black-eyed peas found new life with a hock tucked in. And once the cooking was done, there was often a small reward hidden in the pot. A morsel of tender meat clinging to the bone, prized like treasure by whoever was quick enough to claim it. Beyond the flavor, ham hocks carried symbolism. They reflected a history of resilience, of making the most out of cuts that others discarded. For families, they were proof that thrift didn't mean sacrificing taste. A single hock could stretch across several meals with leftovers turned into soups or gravies. The resourcefulness behind this trick wasn't born from luxury, but from necessity. And yet, it created food with soul. Today, chefs praise nose-to-tail eating as sustainable dining. But in 1960s kitchens, it wasn't a trend. It was everyday life. The ham hock reminds us that magic in cooking isn't about expensive ingredients. It's about the ability to turn the humble into the unforgettable, a gift our elders mastered with quiet genius. Onion and pepper flavor base. Before the days of jarred sauces and pre-mixed seasonings, the backbone of countless African-American dishes in the 1960s started with something simple: onions and peppers sizzling in a skillet. This humble duo wasn't just about aroma, it was the flavor base that built entire meals from the ground up. When money was tight and meat was scarce, Onions and peppers carried the heavy lifting, coaxing depth and warmth into whatever else found its way into the pot. The method was beautifully straightforward. A cast iron skillet was heated with a spoonful of bacon grease, lard, or vegetable oil, and in went chopped onions, followed quickly by bell peppers or, if you had them, hotter chili varieties. The vegetables softened, released their sweetness, and picked up just enough char to create a smoky undertone. Once that foundation was set, anything could follow. Beans, rice, stewed tomatoes, or a scrap of meat to feed a crowd. Even the plainest dish, boiled potatoes or cabbage, felt elevated when it borrowed flavor from that sizzling base. Culturally, the onion and pepper base echoed roots that reached back to African and Caribbean cooking traditions, where holy trinities of aromatics were central to cuisine. In African American households, it was the quiet, consistent reminder that flavor didn't require wealth, just technique. Children grew up recognizing that smell in the kitchen as the signal. Dinner was on the way, and it was going to be good. Today, the food media calls this building flavor layers, but that language misses the point. For our elders, it wasn't some trendy hack. It was survival meeting artistry. With nothing more than onions, peppers, and a hot pan, they could turn scraps into a meal worth remembering. The onion and pepper base was, and still is, proof that flavor begins with the simplest of things. Homemade chili vinegar. Long before hot sauce bottles lined grocery store shelves, many African American households in the 1960s had their own fiery secret weapon sitting quietly on the table: homemade chili vinegar. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't branded, but it was powerful. A glass bottle, often an old soda or mason jar, would be filled with white vinegar and stuffed with whole chili peppers, left to steep until the liquid took on a fiery kick. With just a shake and a pour, a simple meal was instantly transformed. This vinegar had a way of waking up the palate. A dash over collard greens cut through the richness of pork and softened the bitterness of the leaves. A drizzle on beans or black-eyed peas made them sing with sharp, spicy brightness. Fried fish, cornbread, or even cabbage got a lift from its tang. Because vinegar was cheap and peppers could be grown in the backyard or picked up for pennies, this condiment was as practical as it was flavorful. Beyond the bite, chili vinegar carried cultural weight. It was a hand-me-down trick passed quietly through generations. Keep a bottle on the table and you'll never have a dull plate. It represented ingenuity, showing how even the simplest foods could be elevated with a homemade touch. In many homes, every auntie or grandmother had her own version. Some hotter, some sweeter, some with garlic or herbs slipped in for good measure. Nowadays, artisanal hot sauces and infused vinegars are sold as gourmet luxuries. But back then, it was just everyday wisdom. That little bottle on the table wasn't just about spice, it was about making do, making better, and making meals memorable. Homemade chili vinegar proved that creativity doesn't always come in a package. Sometimes it's brewed in your own kitchen, one pepper at a time. The grease jar trick. Tucked in the back corner of nearly every 1960s African American kitchen sat a humble jar, usually an old coffee tin or jelly jar, filled with what looked like liquid gold. This was the grease jar, a quiet, everyday treasure chest of flavor. Every time bacon, salt pork, or fried chicken hit the pan, the rendered fat was carefully poured off, cooled, and saved. It wasn't a waste. It was an investment. That jar was the secret weapon behind countless meals, a silent partner in nearly every dish. The trick was simple but brilliant. Instead of tossing out the drippings, cooks reused them as the base for frying eggs, greasing cornbread skillets, or seasoning vegetables. A spoonful of bacon fat stirred into collard greens gave them smoky depth, while a dab melted in beans transformed a plain pot into something rich and hearty. Even a quick sauté of onions or cabbage gained character from that leftover grease. Nothing tasted quite the same without it. But the grease jar was more than practical. It was cultural memory stored on the counter. In households where money was tight, it represented frugality, resourcefulness, and the idea that nothing good should go to waste. Children grew up knowing the difference between butter, oil, and that special jar of grease. It was an unspoken lesson in thrift, but also in flavor. How to make ordinary food taste extraordinary. Fast forward to today, and chefs rave about cooking with schmaltz or duck fat confit. The grease jar trick was already doing that, just without the marketing. It was sustainability before sustainability had a buzzword. And for many, the sight of that jar still carries nostalgia, a reminder of kitchens that smelled like Sunday breakfast, where ingenuity lived not in store-bought ingredients, but in a jar of saved drippings. Molasses for depth. In the kitchens of the 1960s, sugar was a luxury that didn't always stretch as far as families needed it to. But tucked away in pantries, often in dark glass bottles with labels peeling from use, sat molasses, the thick, dark syrup that was both sweetener and secret seasoning. Born from the byproduct of sugar refining, molasses was inexpensive, shelf-stable, and endlessly versatile. For African American cooks, it wasn't just about sweetness, it was about depth, a richness that transformed humble dishes into something memorable. A spoonful stirred into baked beans gave them a smoky sweetness that clung to the back of the tongue. Mixed into marinades for pork or chicken, molasses provided not just sugar, but a caramel-like backbone that balanced spice and smoke. Even a drizzle into collard greens or black-eyed peas added unexpected complexity, turning everyday staples into soulful meals. And of course, it was a baker's ally, poured into gingerbread, spice cakes, or pecan pies where its dark, bittersweet character sang louder than plain sugar ever could. Molasses carried emotional weight too. It reminded families of older generations, of enslaved ancestors who had long used it out of necessity, turning what was discarded by sugar refiners into sustenance. By the 1960s, it still carried that spirit of resilience, a reminder that even scraps could hold power when used wisely. Children may not have loved the sticky mess it left behind on spoons and countertops, but they certainly loved the flavors it gave to biscuits or warm cornbread. Today, food magazines call molasses underutilized or a secret chef's ingredient. But for our elders, it was everyday wisdom. In their hands, molasses wasn't a trend. It was the difference between bland and bold, between a meal that fed the stomach and one that fed the soul. Church basement punch. If there was ever a drink that defined community gatherings in the 1960s, it was church basement punch. You could find it bubbling away in oversized glass bowls at every wedding reception, homecoming, or Sunday fellowship meal, surrounded by stacks of paper cups and a crowd of kids waiting for refills. It wasn't champagne, it wasn't Coca-Cola. It was something brighter, sweeter, and uniquely homemade. This was the drink that stretched across generations, made from pantry staples and poured with love. The recipe was simple, almost laughably so. A gallon of ginger ale or lemon lime soda, a can of fruit cocktail or pineapple juice, and a couple scoops of rainbow sherbet or lime sherbet plopped in to melt into a frothy, pastel-colored foam. The sherbet gave it body, the soda gave it fizz, and the canned fruit floated around like tiny jewels. It looked fancy enough for a celebration, but it cost pennies compared to store-bought party drinks. In households where money was tight, this punch meant you could still offer abundance to every guest. But more than flavor, church basement punch was about togetherness. Everyone had memories of it. Children sneaking an extra cup, aunties gossiping near the punch bowl, and deacons ladling it out with a grin. It wasn't just a drink. It was a signal that the event was special, that the church family was gathered to celebrate. Its sweetness matched the joy of those moments, creating a ritual as much as a refreshment. Today, you'll find retro punch recipes making their way back into cookbooks and Pinterest boards, often dressed up with fancy garnishes. But the charm of church basement punch lies in its humble roots. It wasn't about presentation. It was about making sure every single person had a cup in hand and that no one left thirsty. Big batch macaroni salad. There are few dishes as tied to community gatherings in the 1960s as macaroni salad, especially when made in bulk. Picture it. A long folding table in a church basement or someone's backyard. Paper plates stacked at one end, fried chicken at the center, and, without fail, a giant bowl of creamy macaroni salad holding its own among the crowd. It wasn't just food, it was a social glue, proof that a simple dish could feed 20 people on a shoestring budget and leave everyone satisfied. The genius was in its simplicity. Elbow macaroni was cheap and plentiful, a single box stretching into a mountain once boiled. To that, cooks added diced celery for crunch, onions for bite, and whatever colorful bits were on hand, hard-boiled eggs, shredded carrots, sometimes even canned peas. The dressing was usually a mixture of mayonnaise, mustard, and a splash of pickle juice, giving it tang and body. Mixed together in one enormous bowl, the result was cool, creamy, and perfect for hot summer afternoons when no one wanted to stand over a stove. But macaroni salad wasn't just about taste, it was about practicality. You could make it ahead, it traveled well, and it got better after a night in the icebox as the flavors mingled. Families loved it because it filled plates without emptying wallets, and kids loved it because, well, pasta covered in mayo has a way of winning young hearts. Emotionally, the dish carried weight. It was there at reunions, funerals, church picnics, and birthday parties. Everyone's aunt or grandmother had her own twist. More eggs, extra relish, a dash of paprika, and each version felt like a signature. Today, it might get sidelined by fancier pasta salads with pesto or arugula. But in the 1960s, big batch macaroni salad was comfort, community, and resourcefulness served cold in a giant bowl. Layered banana pudding. Few desserts carry the weight of Southern nostalgia quite like layered banana pudding. In the 1960s, it was a showstopper at Sunday dinners, potlucks, and family reunions. Easy enough to make on a budget, yet special enough to elicit smiles the moment it was set on the table. Served in deep glass dishes so the layers could shine, it wasn't just dessert. It was edible comfort, a reminder of home, sweetness, and shared memory. The magic began with a box of vanilla wafers, each one carefully arranged to line the bottom of the dish. Sliced ripe bananas went on next, their golden sweetness softening as they nestled against the cookies. Then came the creamy custard or pudding, sometimes homemade from eggs, sugar, and milk, but more often in those busy mid-century kitchens, made from an instant pudding mix whisked to silky perfection. The layering repeated until the dish was filled, each tier promising a bite that was part soft, part creamy, part crunchy. Finally, a crown of whipped topping, or for the cooks who had time and pride, a meringue baked to golden peaks, sealed the creation. Banana pudding's appeal wasn't just in taste, but in tradition. Every family had their way of making it. More bananas for fruit lovers, extra cookies for crunch, or a preference for warm custard versus chilled pudding. Kids fought for the good corner where cookies had soaked just right, while grown-ups savored the nostalgia it brought with each spoonful. What made it remarkable was its balance. Familiar ingredients elevated into something memorable. Unlike cakes that required careful frosting, or pies that demanded perfect crusts, banana pudding thrived in its messy perfection. Today, chefs try to reimagine it in parfait glasses or with gourmet twists, but the layered version of the 1960s remains unmatched, sweet, simple, and made to be scooped generously at family tables. Fried chicken for a crowd. There are few sights more glorious in a church basement or family picnic than a platter stacked high with golden, crispy fried chicken. In the 1960s, when African-American cooks were feeding large families, church congregations, or neighbors dropping by after Sunday service, fried chicken wasn't just food, it was hospitality fried up in a skillet. The smell alone could draw people from across the block, a sizzling promise that something special was happening in that kitchen. Cooking for a crowd, though, was no small feat. Chickens were often bought whole, cut up at home to save money, and seasoned with a steady hand. Salt, pepper, paprika, maybe a touch of cayenne for families who liked heat. Some cooks swore by a buttermilk soak, others by dredging the pieces in seasoned flour alone. Cast iron skillets were the weapon of choice, though resourceful hands often kept 2 or 3 going at once, grease popping while conversations flowed. The trick was in pacing. Fry a few pieces at a time, keep them warm in the oven, and somehow make sure the last drumstick was as crisp as the first. For many, fried chicken wasn't just a recipe, it was a performance. Aunties taught nieces how to test the oil with a sprinkle of flour, how to turn pieces without losing the crust, how to know by ear when the skin had reached its perfect crunch. And when that platter finally hit the table, it didn't matter if there were 20 people or 50. Everyone knew they'd get a piece. Today, fried chicken has been elevated to trendy restaurants and Instagram fame. But its roots remain in kitchens where stretching a bird to feed a crowd was both an art and a necessity. Back then, it wasn't about presentation. It was about gathering folks together, making sure no one left hungry, and creating memories as warm as the chicken itself. Pound cake that travels well. Back in the 1960s, when family reunions, church socials, and Sunday visits were a regular rhythm of life, pound cake was the unsung hero of travel-friendly desserts. It didn't need frosting, it didn't collapse under summer heat, and it never looked pitiful after a 2-hour car ride in the back seat. Instead, it emerged from wax paper or a well-worn tin loaf pan as golden, dense, and dependable as ever. A cake that could withstand both bumpy roads and eager hands sneaking slices before it reached the table. The secret to its success was in its simplicity. True to its name, the old-fashioned version called for a pound, each of butter, sugar, eggs, and flour, though most 1960s cooks had learned to trim and tweak the ratios. Sometimes a splash of vanilla or lemon extract brightened the flavor. Sometimes a glaze was poured on for shine. But the essence of pound cake was never about flash. It was about structure. Firm enough to slice cleanly, rich enough to feel indulgent, and steady enough to sit proudly on a crowded dessert table without needing a spoon or a refrigerator. What gave pound cake its place in the heart of community gatherings was its versatility. A slice could be eaten plain, toasted the next day with coffee, or topped with strawberries and whipped cream if you were feeling fancy. Children loved it because it wasn't too sweet. Adults appreciated it because it paired perfectly with conversation and coffee after a long day. Today, while layer cakes and frosted creations often steal the spotlight, pound cake still holds a quiet dignity. It reminds us of practicality wrapped in sweetness, a dessert built to last, to share, and to travel wherever family and fellowship called. In a world of disposable snacks, pound cake whispers of permanence, of recipes worth keeping and passing along. Turkey necks and gizzards stew. In the 1960s, no part of the bird went to waste, and turkey necks and gizzard stew was proof that frugality could be downright delicious. These humble cuts, often overlooked today, were prized in African American kitchens for their flavor and economy. A bag of gizzards or a few turkey necks could be bought cheaply, simmered low and slow, and turned into a meal that stretched to feed a hungry household. What others dismissed as scraps, resourceful cooks transformed into soul-warming comfort food. The method was as much about patience as it was about ingredients. The turkey necks and gizzards were first cleaned and seasoned, then browned for depth. From there, they simmered for hours in a pot of onions, peppers, celery, and broth until the meat became tender enough to fall off the bone. Potatoes, carrots, or rice often joined the pot, thickening the stew into something hearty and sustaining. A little flour slurry or roux might be added to coax the broth into a gravy-like consistency, perfect for ladling over cornbread or white rice. For many families, this stew wasn't just about nourishment, it was about memory. Kids grew up learning to love the chewy gizzards and the rich meat from the necks, while elders passed down stories over steaming bowls at the dinner table. It was a dish that spoke to resilience, to the ability to make something flavorful and filling out of what was available. Today, turkey necks and gizzard stew is finding its way back into kitchens as people rediscover nose-to-tail cooking and the flavors of tradition. What was once considered poor man's food now reads like a lesson in sustainability and culinary wisdom. In truth, it always was a dish that taught us that nothing should be wasted and that the deepest flavors often come from the humblest cuts. Ground beef stretchers. In the 1960s, when budgets were tight and mouths were many, ground beef was the kitchen's best friend. But even a pound of it had to go a long way, and that's where ground beef stretchers came in. Recipes designed to turn a little meat into a big meal. It wasn't about stinginess, it was about creativity. A single pound could be coaxed into feeding 6 or 8 if you knew how to bulk it up without anyone feeling shortchanged. Cooks had a whole toolbox of tricks. Rice or macaroni were the most common fillers, soaking up flavor and adding body. Breadcrumbs or crushed crackers found their way into meatloaf and meatballs, binding everything together while making it seem more plentiful. Beans were another ally, transforming a small portion of beef into a hearty chili or skillet supper. Vegetables, especially onions, peppers, and cabbage, were chopped finely and sautéed alongside the beef, both for flavor and for stretch. Each addition was practical, but it also made the dish more interesting, less monotonous, and more likely to stick to the ribs. These stretchers carried emotional weight, too. They were the quiet background to countless weeknight dinners. Kids eating at the table before homework, parents tired from long shifts but proud to provide something warm and filling. No one called it budget cooking back then, it was just supper. And while nobody thought twice about the trick, those meals laid down a rhythm of resilience and resourcefulness that still resonates. Today, meal kits and gourmet recipes may boast creative takes on bowls and casseroles. But the DNA of those dishes comes straight from the ground beef stretchers of the past. They remind us that good cooking isn't always about excess. It's about making what you have go further, feeding not just the body, but the whole family gathered around the table. Pig's feet barbecue. In the 1960s, pig's feet barbecue was one of those dishes that carried deep roots and deep flavor, born of thrift and tradition. For many African American families, nothing from the hog was wasted. Every cut had its place, every scrap its purpose. Pig's feet, with their collagen-rich texture, might have looked humble, but slow-cooked and sauced, they transformed into something tender, sticky, and unforgettable. This was a barbecue for folks who knew that flavor didn't always come from the expensive cuts, but from the patience and love poured into the pot. The preparation was a ritual in itself. The feet were scrubbed and cleaned, then simmered long and slow until the meat loosened from the bone, turning the broth into a silky, savory base. Some cooks preferred to bake them after braising, slathering on a homemade barbecue sauce that was equal parts sweet, tangy, and smoky. Others kept it simple. A simmer with onions, garlic, and peppers, followed by a generous splash of vinegar-based sauce that cut through the richness. However it was done, the end result was a dish meant to be eaten with your hands, mess and all, often with a stack of napkins and slices of white bread close by. Pig's feet barbecue wasn't just food. It was a marker of community gatherings, backyard cookouts, and Sunday tables where everyone got a plate, no matter how big the crowd. It was food that reminded people of home, of family members who knew how to stretch a dollar without sacrificing soul. Today, pig's feet have become something of a culinary curiosity, more likely to show up in heritage restaurants or adventurous kitchens. But back then, they were simply practical and beloved. They remind us that barbecue is not just about ribs or brisket. It's about honoring the whole animal, turning even the most overlooked parts into something worth celebrating. Chopped liver and onions. Southern style. In the kitchens of the 1960s South, chopped liver and onions was the kind of dish that carried more meaning than glamour. It was thrifty, hearty, and steeped in tradition, a way to make use of what you had and to turn the parts no one else wanted into something worth gathering around. While liver has always been a polarizing ingredient, for many African American families, it was simply another cut to master, rich in nutrients and deep in flavor when prepared with care. The process was straightforward but required a cook's touch. First came the onions, sliced and slowly cooked down in a skillet until they turned golden and sweet, their fragrance filling the house. Then the liver, usually beef, sometimes chicken, was dredged in seasoned flour and fried until it developed a browned crust. The onions were folded back in, their sweetness taming the liver's strong bite. Some cooks minced or chopped the mixture fine, almost into a spread for bread or crackers. Others left it chunky, served over rice or with cornbread to catch the pan juices. Either way, it was comfort food, the kind of dish that could stretch into multiple meals and feed a family without fuss. But beyond the skillet, chopped liver and onions carried emotional weight. It was the food of hard-working days, of mothers making sure their children got iron and protein, of fathers taking second helpings after long shifts. For some, it was a reminder of childhood suppers eaten at small kitchen tables. For others, it was a lesson in resourcefulness, in finding flavor where others saw none. And today, the liver rarely gets the spotlight, overshadowed by flashier cuts. Yet those who remember it know the truth. With onions, patience, and a steady hand, liver could be transformed into a dish that spoke of resilience and care. A southern plate that turned thrift into comfort and necessity into memory. Fried bologna sandwiches. If there was ever a working-class delicacy of the 1960s, it was the fried bologna sandwich. Cheap, quick, and oddly satisfying, it was the kind of meal you could whip up in minutes, yet remember for a lifetime. Every household had a pack of bologna tucked away in the fridge. Round, pink slices that could be eaten cold, but really came alive when they hit a hot skillet. Frying gave bologna a whole new personality. Edges curling into little cups, the center blistering just enough to add texture, the smell filling the kitchen with a promise of something indulgent even on a lean budget. The sandwich itself was straightforward but comforting. A slice or two of fried bologna went between soft white bread, sometimes with a swipe of mayonnaise, mustard, or even a slice of American cheese that melted just so from the heat of the meat. Some folks went further, tossing in onions, pickles, or a fried egg, transforming it into a true belly filler. It wasn't fancy, but that was the point. It was food that did its job without apology. Fried bologna sandwiches carried a kind of quiet joy. They were after-school snacks for kids, quick lunches for tired parents, or late-night bites when money was low but hunger was high. The sizzle of bologna in a cast-iron pan was often the background music of resilience, proof that comfort could be conjured out of the simplest things. Today you'll find fried bologna sandwiches popping up on trendy diner menus, often marketed as nostalgic comfort food. But for the families who grew up with them, they never needed a revival. They were always there, proof that a hot skillet, a slice of bread, and a little imagination could turn the humblest of ingredients into a meal worth remembering. Sweet potato pie with evaporated milk. In the 1960s, sweet potato pie was more than dessert. It was heritage on a plate. For African-American families across the South, this pie was a holiday centerpiece, a Sunday treat, and sometimes even a midweek indulgence when the garden or market yielded more sweet potatoes than the family could eat boiled or mashed. And one of the quiet heroes that made this pie possible, even in lean times, was evaporated milk. Canned, shelf-stable, and affordable, it ensured a creamy filling without the risk of fresh milk spoiling before it reached the oven. The process was simple but ritualistic. Sweet potatoes were baked or boiled until tender, then peeled and mashed to a smooth golden base. Sugar, eggs, a splash of vanilla, and warm spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves gave the filling its soul. Instead of cream, a can of evaporated milk was poured in, loosening the mash into a velvety custard that baked up firm yet luscious. Poured into a homemade pie crust, or sometimes a store-bought one if time was short, it emerged from the oven fragrant enough to draw neighbors to the porch. This pie wasn't just food. It was a memory baked into every slice. Children licked spoons while mothers and grandmothers debated the proper ratio of spice. The pie was carried to church socials, wrapped carefully for safe transport, or served at reunions where one pie had to stretch to feed 20. The flavor was sweet but earthy, a reminder of the soil and the hands that tended it. Today, Sweet potato pie continues to stand tall against its rival, pumpkin pie, and often outshines it. But in the 1960s, with evaporated milk smoothing the way, it wasn't about competition. It was about tradition, resilience, and making something extraordinary out of what was practical and available. A pie that fed not just the body, but the spirit. Cobbler with canned fruit. In the 1960s, when fresh fruit wasn't always within reach or within budget, canned fruit became a lifesaver in the kitchen. And one of the sweetest ways it showed up was in cobblers. These desserts were humble, bubbling pan of comfort that didn't require perfect produce or fancy equipment. All you needed was a can opener, some flour and sugar, and a willingness to let the oven do the rest. Cobbler with canned fruit became a go-to for family dinners, church potlucks, and Sunday suppers, where dessert was expected but time and money were in short supply. The beauty of the dish was in its flexibility. Peaches, cherries, pears, or even fruit cocktail could serve as the base. The syrup from the can wasn't wasted. It added both sweetness and a glossy finish to the filling. Over the top went either a biscuit-like dough spooned in rustic clumps, or a simple batter that baked into a golden crust as it mingled with the bubbling fruit below. The result was a dessert that felt homemade and generous, even if the fruit had come from a shelf in the pantry. Cobbler with canned fruit carried with it the spirit of resourcefulness. Families who might not have had access to orchards or seasonal markets could still enjoy a dessert that tasted celebratory. Served warm, often with a scoop of ice cream or a splash of evaporated milk, it was more than sweet. It was satisfying. A reminder that good food didn't have to be complicated. Today, food culture may celebrate farm-to-table ideals, but the canned fruit cobblers of the past tell a different story. One of resilience, thrift, and joy made possible by convenience. They were desserts that stretched to feed a crowd, that turned a pantry staple into something special, and that reminded every table of the simple pleasures that could be baked from a can. Sugar syrup substitute. Back in the 1960s, when every penny counted and store-bought luxuries weren't always an option, cooks leaned on homemade sugar syrup as a clever stand-in. It was the quiet hero of the pantry, ready to replace honey, maple syrup, or even corn syrup when the budget or the neighborhood grocery didn't allow for extras. With just sugar, water, and a little patience, families could whip up a glossy, sweet liquid that stretched their resources and kept favorite recipes within reach. The method was straightforward. White sugar and water were simmered together until the mixture thickened into a pourable syrup, sometimes with a splash of vanilla, lemon juice, or molasses stirred in for depth. It could be as thin as simple syrup for sweetening iced tea, or as thick as honey for drizzling over biscuits and pancakes. Some cooks even kept a jar in the fridge ready to stir into morning coffee, glaze a ham, or bind together popcorn balls for a cheap and cheerful treat. But the sugar syrup substitute wasn't just about thrift. It was about keeping tradition alive. Families used it in pies when corn syrup was too expensive, in cakes when honey was out of reach, and in everyday cooking to make sure sweetness was never missing from the table. Children knew it as the sticky drizzle over their hot biscuits, while adults appreciated its ability to stretch a bag of sugar into countless uses. Today, the idea of making a syrup at home might feel old-fashioned in a world of endless store-bought options. But in the kitchens of the past, it was second nature, a reminder that resourcefulness could be as sweet as any luxury. Sugar syrup substitute wasn't just about making do. It was about ensuring that no matter the circumstance, life still had a little sweetness poured on top. Fried apple hand pies. In the 1960s, fried apple ham pies were the kind of treat that made children race to the kitchen and adults sneak a second helping when no one was looking. Portable, satisfying, and easy to stretch from just a few apples, these little pockets of sweetness were a beloved tradition in African American homes across the South. They weren't fancy bakery confections. They were down-home desserts, fried golden and cast iron and dusted with sugar, meant to be eaten warm right out of the paper towel they drained on. The filling was simple: apples, stewed down with sugar, cinnamon, and sometimes a touch of nutmeg, cooked until soft enough to mash but still holding their shape. Some families used dried apples rehydrated on the stovetop, a thrifty trick that allowed the pies to be made year-round. The dough varied from biscuit-like pastry to store-bought canned biscuit dough, but the ritual was the same. Spoon the filling into the center, fold it over, crimp the edges, and slide it carefully into hot oil. The pies came out blistered and crisp, their sugary filling threatening to ooze out with the first bite. These pies weren't just dessert, they were memory makers. Grandmothers passed them down as after-school snacks, church ladies sold them at fundraisers, and mothers packed them in lunch boxes as little surprises. They were the kind of food that traveled well, stayed satisfying even after cooling, and always carried with them the scent of cinnamon and fried dough. Today, fried hand pies are making a comeback at fairs and artisan bakeries, dressed up with gourmet fillings and fancy packaging. But nothing compares to the originals, the ones made in small kitchens, with a handful of apples, a skillet of hot grease, and the knowledge that sometimes the best desserts come folded in half, fried until golden, and shared with love. Jell-O parfaits at church socials. Few desserts captured the spirit of the 1960s church social, quite like Jell-O parfaits. Brightly colored, wobbly, and layered in glass cups, they weren't just desserts. They were cheerful little spectacles. Whether stacked high in a trifle dish or served in humble jelly jars, Jell-O parfaits brought a sparkle to the long folding tables lined with fried chicken, potato salad, and pound cake. They were fun, frugal, and most importantly, easy to prepare in large batches, making them a favorite for gatherings where everyone expected to leave full and happy. The recipe was as simple as it was versatile. A box or two of flavored gelatin, strawberry, lime, or orange, was mixed with boiling water, chilled until it just began to set, then layered with whipped topping or custard. Some cooks added canned fruit cocktail, pineapple tidbits, or sliced bananas suspended in the gelatin like tiny treasures. For a fancy flair, parfaits were built in clear glass, so the colorful stripes and creamy layers shone through, drawing kids and adults alike to the dessert table. But Jell-O parfaits weren't just about sweetness. They were about presentation and pride. Every hostess had her variation, and every church social had at least 2 or 3 versions competing for attention. They represented care because even though they started from a box, the effort of layering, chilling, and serving them in neat cups said, "You mattered enough to make something pretty." Today, parfaits may seem like kitschy nostalgia, but in their time, they were practical genius. Inexpensive, reliable, and endlessly adaptable, they gave even the most modest cook a way to contribute something bright and celebratory. Jell-O parfaits remind us that joy doesn't always come from elaborate recipes. Sometimes it wobbles in a glass dish, layered with love and a little whipped cream on top. Tin can baking. In the resourceful kitchens of the 1960s, nothing was wasted, not even an empty tin can. Long before fancy bundt pans or silicone molds lined store shelves, home cooks turned to what they had on hand, and tin can baking became a clever, practical tradition. Coffee cans, soup cans, even large vegetable tins were scrubbed clean, greased, and lined with wax paper or flour. Into them went cake batter, bread dough, or even puddings, transforming humble scraps of metal into makeshift bakeware that turned out perfectly shaped loaves and cylindrical cakes. This trick was especially beloved for recipes like pound cake, date nut bread, or quick breads. The tall, narrow can creates slices with a unique, round shape, perfect for sandwiches or tea time spreads. Kids were delighted by the novelty of it. Round slices of banana bread tucked into lunch boxes were a small joy in otherwise ordinary meals. The cans also allowed for portion control and travel convenience. One cake could be divided into several smaller loaves, easy to share with neighbors or carry to church functions. Beyond its practicality, tin can baking carried a certain ingenuity that reflected the era's frugality. Why buy expensive pans when the packaging from last week's groceries could be repurposed? It was sustainability, before the word ever became trendy, rooted in the common sense of making do. And the results didn't feel second-rate. In fact, they often carried a special charm. Guests might smile at the sight of a perfectly round slice, but they'd never turn down a piece. Today, when upcycling has become fashionable, tin can baking looks ahead of its time. But for families back then, it wasn't a quirky experiment. It was just good sense. These cakes and breads remind us that sometimes the best tools aren't the fanciest, and that creativity in the kitchen often starts with what's already in the cupboard. One-pot Sundays. In the 1960s, Sunday dinners were often less about flash and more about fellowship, and nothing embodied that better than the humble one-pot meal. After a long morning at church, families came home hungry, but no one wanted to spend hours fussing in the kitchen. The answer was simple: a big pot of something hearty, simmered low and slow, ready to feed whoever showed up at the table. From stews and gumbos to chicken and rice or beans with smoked meat, these dishes were designed for sharing, stretching, and satisfying. The genius of one-pot Sundays was in their flexibility. A single chicken could be stewed with rice, onions, and celery until the grains soaked up every drop of flavor. A few turkey necks, ham hocks, or sausage ends could transform a pot of greens or beans into a meal fit for a crowd. Vegetables from the garden or whatever was left in the icebox found their way into the pot, making sure nothing went to waste. And because everything cooked together, the flavors married beautifully. Meat tender, broth rich, and vegetables softened just enough to melt on the tongue. But these meals weren't just about convenience. They carried with them the rhythm of family life, the clatter of spoons against bowls, the laughter of cousins crowded around the table, the knowledge that you didn't need multiple courses when one good pot could do the job. One-pot meals were democratic too. Everyone ate from the same dish, no matter their station, and everyone left full. Today, we call it meal prepping or one-pan cooking, and pat ourselves on the back for being efficient. But back then, it was just how life was lived: practical, communal, and soulful. One-pot Sundays remind us that the best meals don't always come with centerpieces or side dishes. Sometimes they come bubbling from a single pot, served with gratitude and love. Pantry pickling. In an age before supermarket shelves groaned with every variety of pickle imaginable, home cooks turned to their pantries to practice the quiet art of pickling. Pantry pickling was less about the perfectly crisp dill spear and more about thrift and survival. A surplus of cucumbers, green beans, or even leftover watermelon rinds could be transformed into jars of tangy treasures that lasted through the winter months. For many families, this wasn't a quaint hobby, it was an act of economy, a way to stretch the garden harvest and avoid waste. The process was deceptively simple. A vinegar brine, often spiked with sugar, salt, and whatever spices were on hand, mustard seed, cloves, maybe a dried chili for heat, was poured over vegetables and tucked away in glass jars or even sturdy crocks. Some pickles were meant for quick eating, ready in just a few days, while others were sealed tight and left to age, developing that deep, sour, sweet flavor that could brighten even the plainest meal. A slice of pickle alongside a plate of beans and cornbread wasn't garnish. It was balanced, cutting through richness and giving the palate a spark. Pantry pickling also had a certain communal rhythm. Women gathered in kitchens, boiling brine and sterilizing jars, trading recipes and secrets over steaming pots. Each household had its signature pickle, spicy okra, bread and butter cucumbers, or sweet chow chow. And offering a jar was both hospitality and pride. What's striking today is how modern the practice feels. We call it small batch pickling, or fermentation, and celebrate it as artisanal, yet for our grandmothers, it was ordinary kitchen wisdom. Pantry pickling wasn't about chasing trends. It was about ensuring that no part of the harvest went to waste and that a little bite of summer sunshine could be opened in January. A jar of homemade pickles, lined up in neat rows on a pantry shelf, was more than food. It was foresight, resourcefulness, and care preserved in homemade ice cream hack. Long before countertop ice cream machines and TikTok hacks with condensed milk, families found clever ways to whip up homemade ice cream without fancy equipment. In the 1960s, when a store-bought pint was still a splurge and refrigeration wasn't always dependable, making ice cream at home was part science, part magic, and entirely about joy. Children gathered on porches, cranking old-fashioned churns filled with cream, sugar, and vanilla, while the adults kept the rock salt and ice layered just right. But not everyone had the patience or the churn. That's where the hack came in. Resourceful cooks discovered that you didn't need the wooden barrel or endless cranking to achieve frozen delight. A sturdy coffee can, for instance, could be filled with the ice cream mixture, sealed tight and placed inside a larger can with ice and salt. Kids would roll it back and forth on the kitchen floor, laughing as they unknowingly worked the mixture into creamy goodness. Some used mason jars, shaking until their arms ached. Others relied on shallow pans, stirring the mixture every half hour as it froze, scraping crystals into something smooth and scoopable. It wasn't Ben & Jerry's, but it was cold, sweet, and refreshing. Exactly what a sweltering summer day demanded. Flavors were often simple, but no less indulgent. Fresh peaches from a backyard tree, chocolate syrup swirled in at the last minute, or a dash of instant coffee for a grown-up treat. And when the first spoonful hit your tongue, it didn't matter if the texture was a little uneven or if the vanilla was plain. This was ice cream you made yourself, and that made it special. Today, when viral videos sell us new, no-churn recipes, it's worth remembering. Our grandparents already cracked that code. Sometimes the sweetest innovation is just an old trick in a new kitchen. The cast iron secret. Every Southern kitchen worth its salt had one piece of cookware that never sat shiny on a store shelf. The cast iron skillet. Heavy, black, and often handed down through generations, it wasn't just a pan, it was a legacy. The secret wasn't only in the iron itself, but in how it was cared for. A well-seasoned skillet was more than non-stick, it was practically sacred. Bacon grease rubbed in after every use, a thin sheen of oil baked into its pores, turned plain metal into a trusted kitchen partner that only got better with age. Why was it such a secret weapon? Because cast iron held heat like nothing else. Cornbread came out with crisp, golden edges that no modern pan could mimic. Fried chicken sizzled to perfection, sealing in juices with every crackle of the hot oil. Even simple dishes like smothered pork chops or a pot of greens tasted deeper, richer, as if the skillet itself had absorbed a century of Sunday suppers and was kindly lending that memory back. Of course, cast iron also represented thrift and resilience. You didn't replace it when it wore down, you revived it. A little scrubbing, some reseasoning, and it was as good as new, or better. Families treasured these pans so much that when someone moved out or got married, passing down a skillet was almost as important as a recipe book. Today, cast iron has made a big comeback, with sleek versions lining store shelves and influencers bragging about their seasoning techniques. But the old secret still holds true. The best cast iron skillet isn't the one you buy new. It's the one with a little history, a little wear, and a whole lot of meals behind it. In short, the kind of pan that knows your family as well as you do. That's it for our look back at 30 clever African-American cooking tricks from the 1960s. Proof that resourcefulness, flavor, and love can turn the simplest ingredients into unforgettable meals. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, don't forget to hit like, share it with a friend who loves food history, and subscribe for more stories and recipes from the past brought to life.